Ottilie Bray heard the wagon before she saw it, and did not lift her head. She had stopped looking up an hour before, when the rain started coming sideways, and the last light went out of the sky over Aunt Sula's roof. The window was still lit. It had been lit since 4 o'clock, a small yellow square behind the curtain, and no one had come to it since the door shut. She sat in the ditch with her knees drawn to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, and where her hair had been that morning, there was only stubble and cold rain running into her collar. She had decided, somewhere in the last hour, that she was not going to feel the cold anymore. She would simply stop feeling it, the way she had stopped feeling a great many things that day. The wagon wheels found the ruts and complained about them. A team of two, walking, not hurrying, a man in no rush, or a man who trusted his horses more than the road. The lamp swung on its hook and threw a wet gold circle that walked ahead of the wagon and touched, for one moment, the ditch and the girl in it. The wagon stopped. She heard boots go down into standing water. She did not look up even then, because looking up had gotten her nothing all afternoon, and she saw no reason to spend the effort now. "Miss," a man's voice pitched low, the way a person spoke to a spooked animal. "Miss, can you hear me?" She could. She simply had nothing left to answer with. He crouched. She caught the edge of him in the lamplight, a broad shape in an oilcloth coat, hat brim streaming, eyes that went first to her shaved head and then deliberately would not stay there. He did not ask what had happened to her hair. He did not ask why she was sitting in 3 inches of ditch water at 10 o'clock at night in a nightdress with no shawl. He looked once toward the lit window of the house behind her, and something in his jaw changed, and he did not call out to it either. He got an arm under her knees and one behind her back, and lifted her the way a man lifts a feed sack he does not want to bruise, and she was too tired and too cold to do anything but let him. Somewhere in the lifting, she understood that he was not going to ask her a single question, not one, and that this was the kindest thing that had happened to her since noon. He carried her to the wagon, set her on the bench seat, and put his own coat around her, still warm from him, smelling of wet wool and horse and the mineral smell of salt blocks stacked behind the seat. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and turned the team, and the house with the lit window and the shut door slid away into the rain, and he did not look back at it. After a moment, neither did she. "Marcus Dell," he said, once the gate had swallowed the sound of the wheels. "Ranch 9 miles on, dry house, dry bed. You'll want to sleep first and talk after if there's talking to be done at all." She meant to answer. What came out instead was a sound she was ashamed of, small and broken, and he did not remark on it, only clicked to the horses and let the rain fill the silence, and that too she understood as a kindness. The house, when they reached it, was low and square and smelled of wood smoke and leather. He carried her in rather than let her try her legs on the wet step, set her down in a ladder-back chair pulled close to a banked fire, and built the fire up without being asked, and put water on, and found, from some trunk she did not see him open, a woman's flannel wrapper that had plainly never been worn bought. She would learn later, for a sister who had married and gone to Cheyenne before he'd had the chance to send it, and laid it over the chair back without a word and went out to see to the team. He was gone long enough that she understood he had done it on purpose, to give her the room and the fire to herself. When he came back in, stamping rain off his boots at the door, he did not look at her directly, busied himself instead with the stove, and said only, "There's a bed in the back room. Mine, but it's made up clean, and I'll not be using it tonight or any night you're under this roof unless you tell me different. I sleep fine in the barn, always have, when the weather asked it of me." It was, she thought later, the first time in her life a man had told her where he would sleep instead of where she would. She did not sleep that first hour, though the bed was dry and the quilt was heavier than any she had owned. She lay with her hand against her own scalp, feeling the strangeness of it, the stubble under her palm where 3 days before there had been a braid down to her waist, and she went back over the day the way a tongue goes back to a broken tooth, unable to leave it alone. It had started on a Tuesday, with a soreness in her throat she had thought was only a cold. By Wednesday, 2 children on the Larkin place had died of the fever that had been working its way down the valley since the middle of August, and by Thursday morning, Aunt Sula had her ear pressed to Ottilie's door before the sun was fully up, listening to her breathe. Her aunt was not a cruel woman. Ottilie made herself hold to that, lying in the dark in a stranger's bed, because it was true, and because it mattered to her that it stay true. Sula Prout had taken her in 5 years before, when there was no one else living who shared her blood, and had fed her and clothed her, and never once, in 5 years, raised a hand to her. But Sula had buried a husband and 2 infants of her own before Ottilie ever came to the door, and grief had left in her a fear of fever that sat under her skin like a splinter that never worked its way out. And when the newspaper pamphlet came round from the county doctor, shave the head, burn the linens, isolate the sick from the well, Sula had read it standing in her own kitchen with her hand pressed flat over her heart. And by the time she came to Ottilie's room, she had already decided. She had not been unkind about it, even then. She had cried while she did it, the shears trembling in her hand, saying she was sorry, saying it was for everyone's good, saying Ottilie would understand when she was older. And Ottilie, aching and feverish and too weak to fight her, had sat still on the kitchen stool and let her aunt shave her scalp bare while apologizing the entire time, which was somehow worse than if she had said nothing at all. Then had come the nightdress, and the quilt and the rag doll Ottilie had kept since she was 7 years old, all of it carried to the yard and burned, because the pamphlet said linens carried fever, and Sula was not going to take the chance, not with the Larkin children not yet cold in the ground. And then, because Ottilie's fever had not broken, and Sula's nerve had, in the end, broken worse, she had put her out past the gate, with only a borrowed nightdress and no shawl, to wait out the sickness, or not wait it out at a distance her aunt's conscience apparently required, and had gone inside and lit the lamp, and not come back to the window, even once, in 6 hours, to see whether the girl in the ditch was living or dying. Ottilie had understood, sitting in that ditch, that she was 19 years old and had no mother, no father, no brother, and now, functionally, no aunt, and that there was not one soul on the whole of the earth whose lamp was lit for her. She turned her face into the strange pillow in the strange dark, in the house of a man she had known for 2 hours, and found that she was crying for the first time all day, and that the crying, unlike everything else, would not stop simply because she decided it should. Marcus heard it through the wall. He sat a long time on the edge of the cot he dragged into the barn, listening to the rain ease on the roof, and under it, the sound of a girl grieving alone in his house, and did not go to her, because he understood, without being able to have said how he understood it, that what she needed from him just then was not comfort, but the plain fact of a shut door, and no one behind it asking anything of her at all. He did not ask her anything the next day either, nor the day after that. He was not, by nature, a man who required explanations before he would act. He had decided what needed doing at the edge of that ditch, and the deciding had been the whole of it for him. He brought in water for her to wash with, and did not comment on how long she stood over the basin studying her own reflection, hollow-eyed, shorn, a stranger to herself. He rode into Ash Hollow on the 2nd day, and came back with a bolt of gray wool and a paper of pins, and set them on the kitchen table without a word, because he had noticed, without saying so, that she owned nothing but a borrowed flannel wrapper and a nightdress that was not even hers. He ate his supper across from her both nights and talked, when he talked at all, about the salt he'd been hauling, or a heifer with a bad foot, or the state of the north fence, ordinary things. The kind of talk a person could rest inside of. On the third evening, with the dishes cleared and the lamp turned up, she found she could not eat the silence any longer. "You haven't asked," she said. He looked up from the harness strap he was mending on his knee. "Asked what?" "Any of it. Why I was in that ditch, what I did, whether I've people looking for me, whether your name's going to be dragged through the county for having me under this roof." Her voice shook on the last of it, though her chin did not. "You just carried me in, like it was nothing to decide." Marcus set the strap down and was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "I've lived on this land 11 years, he said finally. "In that time, I've seen wolves take calves, seen a man freeze not 400 yards from his own porch because pride wouldn't let him knock on his neighbor's door, and seen a fever run through this valley twice, and take children out of houses that prayed over them every night of their lives. I've seen a fair amount, is what I'm saying. I never yet saw a good reason to leave a person sitting in cold water when I had a dry wagon seat and nowhere urgent to be." He picked the strap back up, then set it down again, because she had not looked away, and he seemed to feel that owed her the whole of his attention. "As for what happened, I expect you'll tell me when telling does you some good, and not before. But since you've opened the door on it yourself, I'll ask you one thing only, and it isn't why. It's what you want done about it." No one in 19 years had ever asked Ottilie Bray what she wanted done about anything. She sat with the question the way a person sits with an unfamiliar coin, turning it, unsure of its value. "I don't know," she admitted at last. "I don't know that I want anything done. I only want it to stop being true." "It'll be true a while yet," he said, not unkindly. "But it needn't be the truest thing about you. That much is yours to decide, whatever your aunt decided about the rest." She told him the whole of it that night, start to finish. The fever and the shears and the burning yard and the 6 dark hours at the window that never opened. And he listened without once reaching for his hat or his temper. And when she finished, he said only, "Thank you for trusting me with it," which was so far from the outrage she had braced for that she nearly wept a second time, from the relief of it. The county did not extend her the same courtesy. It began, as such things do, with a woman noticing a wagon on a road at an hour it had no business being noticed, and grew, by the retelling, into a scandal fully formed. Within 2 weeks it was known from the Ash Hollow Mercantile to the last claim on Willow Creek that Marcus Dell had a girl living under his roof, who was no kin to him, unmarried, and shaved bald as an egg besides, which last detail somehow did more damage to her reputation than the living arrangement itself, as though her sickness were a mark against her character, rather than a thing that had been done to her by other hands. The Reverend Aldous Rourke rode out on a Sunday afternoon in October, hat in hand, plainly uncomfortable with his own errand, and stood in Marcus's dooryard, explaining that a barn was a fine gesture, but did not, in the eyes of the congregation, settle the matter, and that people would talk regardless of where a man laid his own head at night. Marcus heard him out to the end without raising his voice, which the Reverend would later describe to his wife as more unsettling than shouting would have been, and said only that Miss Bray was welcome in his house for as long as she required it, and that he would thank the congregation to spend its concern on whichever household had put a fevered girl out into a rainstorm, rather than on the one that had taken her out of it. The Reverend left with his hat back on and nothing settled at all, which was, in its way, the only honest outcome available to either of them. Aunt Sula, for her part, told a version of events in which Ottilie had taken fright during her illness and run off in the night, ungrateful for 5 years of a roof and a table, and would not be persuaded, not by her own conscience, which surely knew better, and not by the neighbors who had seen the burnt heap in her yard and drawn their own conclusions, to say otherwise. Ottilie heard the story secondhand, from the mercantile clerk's wife, who told it to her kindly enough and watched her face while she did it. And Ottilie stood in the middle of the store with a bolt of thread in her hand, and understood that she had lost not only her home and her hair, but the true account of what had happened to her, and that her aunt would rather be thought careless with the truth than be known as a woman who had put a sick girl out to freeze. In November, before the worst of the talk had cooled, Ottilie rode into Ash Hollow herself for a spool of black thread and a paper of needles, thinking a 10-minute errand could not cost her much. She was wrong. She had not gone 3 steps past the mercantile step before she found her way blocked, pleasantly enough on the surface, by 3 women of the sewing circle her aunt had once belonged to, headed by a Mrs. Otway who had never in 5 years spoken to her directly, and now seemed unable to stop. "Well," Mrs. Otway said, looking her up from the kerchief down, "if it isn't Sula Prute's girl. Living out at the Dell place now, I hear, under a bachelor's roof, and no ring on your hand that I can see." She said it lightly, the way a person drops a stone down a well to hear how deep it goes. "Your aunt must be worried sick over you, wherever you took yourself off to that night." "My aunt knows exactly where I am," Ottilie said, "and exactly how I came to be there, whatever she's told the rest of you." Her voice held, but her hands, hidden in her cloak, had gone to fists. "I'm sure she does." Mrs. Otway's smile did not move. "It's only that a decent girl doesn't generally need rescuing from her own front yard, is what folks are saying. Makes a person wonder what she'd done to be out there in the first place." It was Marcus, come from the feed store in time to hear the last of it, who stepped between them without raising his voice above what the street could carry. "What she'd done," he said, "was catch a fever same as half this valley did, and get put out in the rain for it by a woman too frightened to open her own door. If you've a question about that morning, Mrs. Otway, I was there and Sula Prute was not, and I'll answer it plain, right here, in front of whoever cares to listen." No one, in the end, cared to listen further. The street emptied itself of the sewing circle inside a minute, and Ottilie stood by the wagon with her thread unbought, and her face burning in a way the November wind could not account for. She did not go into town again before spring, and when Marcus suggested, some weeks later and gently, that she might come with him for the Christmas social, she refused so plainly and so fast that he did not raise it a second time. Her hair came in slowly and badly through that winter, in uneven tufts, coarse in some places and bare in others, nothing like the smooth, dark braid it had been. She took to keeping the kerchief tied close over it even indoors, even at Marcus's own table. "They'll look at me," she said, when he asked her why she would not go, some weeks later still, in the flat voice she used now for anything that touched on the subject. "They already look at me like I did something shameful, and I didn't do anything at all, it was done to me, and somehow that's worse in their accounting than if I'd earned it. I sat in that ditch 6 hours, Marcus, and nobody came. Not one soul in this whole valley thought I was worth opening a door for. I've made my peace with what that means about my worth. I'd rather stay home and not be reminded of it in the mercantile." "That's not what it means," he said. "It's what it proved." He did not argue her out of it that night, though it cost him something not to, and she saw that it cost him something, and was almost sorry for it, and stayed silent anyway, because the flat voice had become, by then, easier to live inside than hope had ever been. Winter went out hard and came back in wet, and by the first week of April the fever was moving through the valley again, riding in on the spring thaw the way it had the autumn before, worse this time for starting among households already thinned by the last visitation. It went first through the Larkin place a second time, then jumped the creek to Willow Claim, and on the second Tuesday of April it went into Aunt Sula Prute's house and put both her and her 12-year-old nephew Beau, the only family she had left under her own roof, to bed with the same burning throat that had once sent Ottilie into a ditch in the rain. The doctor who rode the circuit for 3 counties was already worn thin nursing the lark in place and could not be spared. There was no one in Ash Hollow who had survived the fever and could therefore be trusted near it without carrying it further. No one, that is, except the one person the whole valley had watched shaved and turned out the autumn before, whose body had already fought the sickness once and won. It was Marcus who brought her the word, riding in from town with his jaw set in a way she had learned to read as trouble he did not know how to soften. She heard him out the fever in the valley again, the Prout house struck, Beau delirious by the 2nd day, Sula herself too weak by the 3rd to fetch her own water. And she sat very still at the table with her hands folded in her lap, and Marcus, watching her, braced for the flat voice, for the closed door, for the answer he privately believed she was entitled to give, and no one on earth could fault her for giving. "I'll need the wool cloak," she said instead, "and you'll need to drive me, because I don't know that house as well from its cistern any more, and Beau will be frightened of a stranger's face if there's no one he trusts to bring me in." "You don't owe her anything," Marcus said. "Nobody this side of heaven would think less of you for staying home." "I'm not going for her," Ottilie said, and stood, and reached for the cloak herself before he could hand it to her. "I'm going because there's a boy in that house who never did anything to me, and because I'm the only person within 40 miles who can walk into that room without carrying the fever in on me instead of out. That has nothing to do with what I'm owed. It only has to do with what I can do that no one else can." He drove her in himself, through mud axle-deep in places, and left her at the gate because the house was closed to the well. And it was the hardest thing he had done since the night he lifted her out of the ditch, driving away from that gate and leaving her behind it. The 11 days that followed became, in Ash Hollow, the kind of story a town tells for a generation. Ottilie moved into the Prout house with a jar of carbolic and a stack of clean linen. Marcus left twice a day at the gate post, and did not leave it again until the fever broke. She sat up 3 nights running with Beau when his fever spiked past what the body ought to survive, packing him in wet sheets when the heat climbed too high, spooning broth past lips too cracked to ask for it, talking to him in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, the horses at the Dell place, the shape of clouds, anything that gave a frightened boy's mind a thread to hold through the worst of the 3rd night, when his breathing went so shallow that she sat with her hand flat on his chest simply to be certain, minute to minute, that it went on. Aunt Sula, weaker but never as close to the edge as the boy, watched her niece nurse the child from a sickbed across the room and said, on the 5th day, in a voice worn down past pride, that she had been wrong, and that she had known it the night she lit the lamp and could not make herself walk to the window, and that the knowing had sat in her every day since like a stone she could not put down. Ottilie did not absolve her that day. She only kept working cool cloths, broth, the low, steady voice, because Beau's fever had not yet turned, and there would be time enough for the rest of it if there was time at all. The circuit doctor found a spare hour on the 6th day and rode out to look in on the Prout house, expecting, he admitted afterward, to find a household barely managing. He found instead a boy's fever charted by the hour in a hand he did not recognize, cloths soaking in a bucket of vinegar water exactly as the newest medical papers advised, though no one had shown Ottilie those papers, and a nurse on her feet in a stained apron who had not slept more than 2 hours running in 6 days and did not intend to start now. He stood in the doorway a moment taking it in, then set down his bag and said only, "Where did you learn to do this, Miss Bray?" And Ottilie, without looking up from the cloth she was wringing, said, "Nowhere. I had it myself last fall, and I paid close attention to what didn't help. which was as near to the whole truth as she cared to give a stranger, however kind his face. He checked Beau's pulse, checked Sula's breathing, allowed that there was little he could add to what was already being done, and rode back to the Larkin place, saying to anyone who asked that Ash Hollow had a nurse in it better than any he'd trained under, and that she was, at present, keeping a boy alive with nothing but vinegar, water, and will. On the 7th night the boy's fever broke at last, sudden and complete, the way fevers sometimes do, leaving him weak and drenched and blessedly, entirely alive. And Ottilie sat on the floor beside his bed in the gray hour before dawn and put her face in her hands and let herself, finally, shake. Word of the boy's turn reached the gate post before sunrise, carried by a neighbor woman who had been watching the house from her own porch every night of the 11, unable to sleep for wondering, and by full light half of Ash Hollow had heard some version of it, that the girl who had been shaved and put out in the rain had walked into a burning house that no one else would enter and pulled a child back from the edge of the grave with her own 2 hands and never once asked what she was owed for it. The same neighbors who had crossed the street rather than passed to near Marcus Dell's gate the autumn before now stood along the road at a respectful distance, hats off, as the quarantine flag came down on the 11th day, and Ottilie Bray walked out through Aunt Sula's gate for the last time, thinner, hollow-eyed, her badly grown hair hidden under a kerchief gone gray with washing, looking, to every soul watching, like exactly what she was. A woman who had given 11 days and every ounce of her strength to a household that had once given her nothing at all, and had done it without once being asked. Marcus was waiting at the end of the lane, where he had waited every evening of the 11 days without once being let past the gate, and he came forward now at a pace just short of running, and stopped a foot from her, close enough that she had to tip her face up to his, and did not, for a long moment, say anything at all, only looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night in the lamplight, as though committing something to memory he intended to keep. "You could have stayed clear of that house," he said finally, low. "Nobody would have thought less of you." "You said that already." "I know it. I needed to say it once more, now that I've had 11 days to think on what it would have cost me if that fever had turned on you instead of the boy." His voice, always so level, was not quite level now. "I stood at that gate every night not knowing, Ottilie, and I want you to understand there is a particular kind of praying a man does watching a lamp burn in a window he isn't allowed past, and I did every bit of it, and I'll not be doing it again if I can help it." She thought, absurdly, of another lamp in another window, the autumn before, and of how differently a lit window could sit in a person's chest, depending on who was watching it and why. "Then don't," she said. "Help it, I mean, if there's a way." "There's one I know of." He took her bare, chapped hand in both of his, careful of it the way he had once been careful of her whole weight in the rain, and did not kneel, did not make a show of it, only stood there in the mud of the lane with the whole of Ash Hollow watching from a respectful distance, and asked her the one thing he had been carrying since a night in October when she told him what she wanted done about her aunt, and he had understood, even then, that the honest answer to what he wanted done about his own heart had already been decided at the edge of a ditch in the rain. "Marry me, Ottilie. Not because you've nowhere else to go. You've a home with me, whether you say yes or no. That was settled the night I carried you in, and it isn't a bargain I'm looking to unsettle now. Marry me because I have spent 11 days learning exactly what it is to stand at a gate and want in, and I find I don't care to spend one more night on the wrong side of a door where you are." Ottilie Bray, who had sat in a ditch the autumn before, and decided that no lamp in the whole world was lit for her, stood in the mud of a spring lane with her ruined hair under a gray kerchief and her hand held careful in a rancher's 2 hands, and found that she was, for the first time since she was a very small girl, entirely certain of something. "Yes," she said, and the word came out steadier than any word had come out of her in a year. "And Marcus, this time leave the door open. I mean to walk through it myself." He did, and for the rest of both their lives, whatever else the seasons brought to that house, the lamp in the window never once went dark on either side of the glass.